The criticism of Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Zizek of the debate is unfounded. My name is Marc Aupiais. I find the criticism of both Jordan B. Peterson and Slavoj Zizek to be unwarranted. They had a good and enlightening discussion that benefited everyone. I suspect the alleged former fans didn't know much of either before losing their appreciation of either figure. Peterson has deep and systematic understanding of communism. Communism is not limited to the Communist Manifesto, which he had read before and read again in detail before debating Zizek. Marx wrote a lot more than it, and most of what he wrote Peterson has a good grasp of. Zizek prefers works of Marx other than the Communist Manifesto. Even when I studied him in university, he was not a true communist. He liked some Marx, and those parts he discusses are actually parts Jordan Peterson has a grasp of, while somewhat disagreeing. I am very impressed with Jordan Peterson's performance in the debate with Slavoj Zizek, and think those who are now attacking him or Zizek over the debate need to re-evaluate their thinking and their fickleness. Displaying fickleness isn't attractive as a trait. Like those who recently felt the need to disown Stéphane Molyneux and claimed his positions had changed. Untrue. The rush of new, former Jordan B. Peterson fans leave me with the impression they had never read a word he has written, nor watched his lectures at all. Virtue signaling? Jordan Peterson's understanding of communism is not from a political science perspective, it's from a psychological and sociological perspective. He will go into great detail in regards the Gulag Archipelago or other works by people who deeply understood or lived communism or the spirit of the Russian people. Likewise, when speaking of Nazism, he doesn't look at the various manifestos of the Nazi Party easily found online. Instead, he looks deeper. He looks to people who had an understanding of what was going on the ground. So the fact that Jordan Peterson had only really read the Communist Manifesto once before when he was quite young is not really something which takes away from who he is as a person. And Slavoj Zizek has always been a strange sort of communist in that he doesn't believe economic communism works. He also isn't an intersectionist. That is to say, he doesn't believe what many would term to be cultural Marxism, not in the sense of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, but in the sense that many people on the left who had been in support of Marxism began to disavow it, and they took the whole narrative of oppressor and oppressed and the idea that history was all about that, and switched class for racism and sexism. And so that's the belief of cultural Marxism that you'd hear from someone like Jordan Peterson. Intersectionality, essentially. That's not the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, which Wikipedia likes to highlight, or rather the people who consistently edit it to take that sort of position. Now, Zizek and Jordan Peterson both agree on many things. Peterson actually comes from a left tradition and has moved more central over the years. And he'd have George Orwell and people like that as many of his influences on communism. You'll notice that they are mostly left-wing sorts of influences, or people who flirted with the left at some stage. Slavoj Zizek also is quite left-wing in that sense. And when Peterson started his part of the debate with a takedown of the Communist Manifesto, Zizek looks at it and he says, I don't really like Communist Manifesto anyway, because he doesn't really believe in the communism of Marx entirely. He likes his criticisms, especially in a book like Capital, which Jordan Peterson is very critical as a book, but largely they're in agreement, which is why you see this strange situation where they sort of start off at odds with each other, and with the reputation of one another. And Peterson didn't really research Slavoj Zizek because there's so much to research, but probably should have just watched some videos of him debating. That would have given him the idea that Zizek isn't a true communist. He's as communist as Peterson is Christian. And that's not to say that Peterson isn't Christian. It's just to say that he views Christianity through what's healthy psychologically, and through living a life he deems so healthy psychologically, rather than in the classical religious sense of the word, if you really get down into detail what Peterson believes. And Zizek, in the same sense, is a communist, and Peterson challenged him about pushing the ideas of Marx, but to Zizek, that is the foundation of his views. In fact, earlier thinkers and different thinkers in Marx are. But Marx is a part of that, and communism is a part of that. So you have two people who take positions which aren't really the positions you'd hear from their reputations, but which are their actual positions. And seeing their debate, or rather their discussion, it was very beneficial. It was a nice debate to watch. But you weren't having a situation of, let's take Stefan Molyneux for an example, of a true free market capitalist against, well, a true communist or intersectionalist or cultural Marxist, so to speak. Instead, you have two people with very similar views who are both mavericks, both outspoken, and both take very specific positions. And so Zizek believes capitalism works as an economic system, though he still has concerns about people down below. So does Jordan Peterson. But Zizek points out that China, as it did, took hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, out of extreme poverty, by adapting and adopting some restricted capitalism while at the same time maintaining their extreme social control, and expresses his fears that the system is a system which works well for government and might spread. He also worries about ecological catastrophe and doesn't really like Donald Trump very much. Peterson, in contrast, I suspect might even have voted for Donald Trump if he were American. So it's different perspectives, but really it was a discussion. Some people actually suggested that perhaps they should have just had a podcast sort of debate without the audience. In fact, the audience has been slandered a lot online. People say that the audience clapped too much, laughed too much, was distracting. When I watched it, it wasn't really that distracting. It was just an audience in front of two figures who they were fans of. And they paid a lot of money to be there, so they had every right to do that. And so what did they discuss? Well, you have Peterson's takedown of Marxism, and then Slavoj Zizek is like, well, okay. And then you have Zizek talking about political correctness and the dangers of it. He is very skeptical of happiness, though at the same time Peterson is also very skeptical of happiness. So two people who are skeptical of happiness and think that meaning, in the case of Peterson, is more important, that happiness is sort of a grace which comes when things work. In fact, Zizek talks about how people who were in the Communist Party became elected after democracy was introduced in Eastern countries, and he said that that was the danger of happiness at work. Both of them take very similar positions in these sort of things. Zizek takes the strange position of saying that a man whose wife is cheating on him, if he feels jealous, that's pathological, even if the wife's cheating on him. And then he sort of tries to expand that to fear of immigrants and all sorts of things, which is a bit ridiculous as an example and doesn't really work. And you also see him pushing certain views which are problematic, and Peterson also pushes some problematic views, and you can see Zizek's strong dislike of religion, and Peterson doesn't really challenge him very much on that, even though Peterson believes that religion can be a very good thing, and that Marxism in fact is something which is quite dangerous. They differ in their views of Foucault. Um, Peterson sees him as continuing Marx's journey, while Zizek sees him as critical of communism. And you have discussion of things such as Carl Jung. You have discussion of sort of analytical psychology and so forth, and individual responsibility and things such as that. And it's an interesting debate. It's an interesting conversation. If you don't go into it wanting one side to defeat the other, or wanting to lose respect for one side or other. I've long been critical of Slavoj Zizek since my university days when I studied him. And he's just himself. He is who he is. And Jordan Peterson's interesting. He contributes a lot, and he brings a lot to both psychology and sociology. They're both maverick figures, and it's interesting to watch them debate. But criticizing them as lacking integrity in debate, or not being who they really are, in the case of Jordan Peterson, where people say, he doesn't really understand Marxism. He does. He has a very good understanding of Marxism from a psychological and sociological perspective. You want to get someone with a very good understanding of Marxism from an economic perspective, you talk to an economist. Political science, perhaps someone with an understanding of that. Philosophy, great. But his not regularly reading the Communist Manifesto doesn't make him someone who can't speak on Marxism. It just means he speaks on it from a different perspective. So it's an interesting debate, and I recommend watching it, but also to watch it as something where you can gain from a debate and a discussion, rather than as a prize fight, which is almost like they introduced it at the beginning.